I'm Jenny Johns. I'm a psychologist who works for the Northumbria Cancer Psychology Service, and we're going to have a conversation about the psychological component of fatigue. Well, I think we thought about two ways in which people can approach fatigue from a psychological point of view. The first is to think about acceptance of things as they are, and also kind of being kind to yourself when you're going through fatigue. And the second is thinking about your values, thinking about what matters to you, and making choices and decisions in line with your values. So I guess when we think about acceptance, people are in a situation with fatigue that they don't want to be in. Nobody wants to feel fatigued. Nobody wants the sort of impact on their life that comes along with fatigue. So when we talk about acceptance, we're not saying we're asking you to accept this is fine, that you're happy with it, but we're looking at accepting things as they are. So finding ways of coming to terms with what's happening rather than struggling with it and fighting against it. So that idea of letting go of the struggle might involve noticing the sort of thoughts that show up when you're feeling frustrated, maybe that you can't do the things that you used to, when you're feeling guilty. So thoughts that might be, I should be able to do more, this means I'm a bad mum if I'm not doing this. So that idea of, can we notice the thoughts that come up when we are feeling fatigued and the emotions that go with them, and make some space for the difficult emotions. If people are feeling sad, if they are feeling frustrated, rather than feeling like, oh, I should pull myself together. Anything that starts a should or a shouldn't, we need to be really careful of. But those sort of thoughts and feelings will show up. So yeah, I think that idea of how do we find ways of practicing acceptance around some of the challenges that come up. So one of the techniques we talk to people about is something called diffusion, or what that means is kind of unhooking from difficult thoughts. So with some of those examples I talked about, so thoughts like I should be able to do this, or this makes me a bad mum or a bad wife, using this technique that we call name it to tame it, where we get people to notice the thoughts they're having and say something to themselves like, I notice I'm having a self-critical thought, or I notice that I'm having a worry thought. And when we do that, it allows us to step back a little bit from those thoughts, to treat them as a thought rather than a fact. And just getting into the practice of doing that regularly helps you from sort of spiralling with those thoughts and feeling kind of overwhelmed by them. I think when we work with patients, self-criticism's often around. People aren't functioning the way that they used to. So it can be quite easy, especially if your mood's low, to fall into some of those self-critical thoughts. So like I said, I should or I shouldn't, or this is what this means about me if I'm not doing the things that I normally do. And what we know is that if we get really caught up in self-critical thoughts, it can really make things worse. So if we're thinking about self-criticism, there's a model that can really help us understand this, which uses 3 circles to explain how our emotions are regulated. So first of all, we've got our threat system. So our threat system gets switched on when we are attending to danger. And when that system gets switched on, we release hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. We've got our soothing system, which gets switched on when we feel safe, peaceful, calm, connected to people who are important to us or places that are important to us. And when that system's switched on, we might, our body releases things like oxytocin, so the cuddle hormone. And then we've got our drive system, and our drive system gets switched on when we are working towards things to try and achieve, when we are enjoying things. So that relates to the hormone dopamine. So those 3 systems that regulate our emotions. And what's really important when we consider self-critical thoughts is that we need to understand that these thoughts can turn the volume up on our threat system, making it even harder to function and feel okay. So when we're working with people with cancer and with fatigue, what we often notice is when we first meet people, their threat system might be very overactive because of what they're going through and their fears around the cancer. In terms of fatigue, people might be feeling stressed because they can't do all the things they normally do. So often their threat circle's a bit bigger. Maybe their soothing system might have shrunk down a little bit. That circle's a bit smaller because they can't maybe get out and see people as much as they usually would. They can't do the things that would normally help them to feel calmer. And their drive system again might have shrunk down, so that their energy levels, obviously with the fatigue, but lots of things about the opportunities they have to have a sense of achievement. So often those three circles are out of balance, and what we're often working with people to do is to try and help them to balance those circles out. And what's really helpful is that the soothing system and the drive system circles can turn the volume up or down on the threat system. So we often draw these circles out with people and say, well, where are you now? And then try and think with them about what can we do that can shrink the threat circle down, and what can we do that turns the volume up on your soothing system or your drive system. But I think the important thing for that diagram for the purposes of fatigue is that idea of self-critical thoughts can turn the volume up on your threat system, mean you're releasing more adrenaline, more cortisol, becoming more stressed. And that if we can practice some of the self-compassion techniques, that's switching on your green system, your soothing system, and balancing that out. Because what we're trying to get is that those three circles are kind of in balance, rather than one being bigger and the other ones being smaller. So if we're thinking about this idea of self-criticism and it's switching on our threat system, one of the ways in which we can approach that is using the name it to tame it technique that we spoke about before. So I notice that I'm having a self-critical thought. We often speak to ourselves in ways that we wouldn't dream of speaking to someone else. And it's amazing sometimes how habitual that is. People are doing it without even realising. What I sometimes talk about with people is if they live with somebody, a family member, a partner, see if they can help them to notice that, because sometimes it's so automatic, people are doing it without even noticing. So just getting into the habit of naming those things, not buying into those thoughts, but just noticing them. And then there's all sorts of things that people can do to switch on their soothing system. So things like general self-care things, things that have got some nice sensory aspect to them: baths, massages, smelly candles, favourite cuddly jumpers, all of those sort of things will switch on your soothing system. Thinking about maybe a safe place, so that might be a place in your house, a place in your garden, somewhere that you go to that's special to you. One of the exercises we often do with people as well is not necessarily somewhere you physically go to, but somewhere you go to in your head. So we know that when we use imagery, it can switch on all of these chemicals just as easily as if you actually go to a place. And the nice thing about using imagery is you can use it anywhere, nobody knows you're doing it. You can use it in a waiting room, you can use it on a bus. So there's some lovely exercises that people can use that are switching on their soothing system by using images. We sometimes get people practicing compassionate self-talk. So we talked about critical thoughts. So often we get people to either imagine that they're talking to somebody they care about, and using the sort of kindness and compassion that the things they'd say to somebody if they were having the same thoughts, a friend or a family member. Or we flip that round and we say, if somebody who cared about you was having, knew you were having this thought, what would they say to you? So getting people to practice it that way. We sometimes again use imagery and get people to imagine, a compassionate being. So for some people they imagine like an angel. People use characters out of films or books, but something that they can draw on that they can imagine talking to themselves when they're having those critical thoughts, to just balance things out so they're not as hooked into that self-criticism. So I've had people use kind of film characters, book characters, people they know, people they admire, just to help them to kind of talk to themselves in a different way. We sometimes extend that into letter writing. So sometimes people have noticed all the kind of critical thoughts they have around their fatigue and written a letter to themselves in the first person that might start, "Dear Ben, dear Sarah, I know you're really struggling with your fatigue," and writing a letter that's got all of that kind of kindness in, talking to themselves in the way that they talk to someone else, that can be really helpful with that. And then I guess there's lots of practices like relaxation exercises, mindfulness practice, yoga for some people, breathing exercises that can really regulate your nervous system. And all of those things are really, really helpful for kind of calming your soothing system down. Of the importance of pacing when it comes to managing fatigue. And I think one of the metaphors I find really helpful that I often talk to patients about is the spoons analogy. So this came from a lady in America who was struggling with fatigue, and she was trying to explain this to a friend of hers. So they were at a diner in America, and she said to her friend, "It's like in the morning, somebody gives me 10 spoons," and she emptied like 10 spoons out from the cutlery drawer on the cutlery jar on the table and said, "So one morning, that's all I've got, and I can get to spend those spoons any way I like, but I don't have any more, any less. It's 10 for the day until the next morning." So she was explaining to her friend, so for example, getting up and getting myself ready might have taken 2 spoons this morning. Coming out and meeting you here, that's kind of 6 spoons. That's been a lot to kind of get myself, here and get on the, transport and all of that. So I've really only got 2 spoons left when I get home, so I can't expect too much of myself this evening. And I think it's a really helpful metaphor for patients to help them to think about how they manage their energy, but also to explain to family members and to kind of communicate it. Lots of kind of couples and families that I work with will kind of use that metaphor, and so we've got a hospital appointment today, that's probably going to be about 5 spoons, isn't it? So should we just leave that thing in the garden till tomorrow? So I think it's a nice, really practical way of thinking about how you divide up your time when you've not got as much energy as you'd like to have. And I think what we think about when we talk about living in line with your values is, if you are going to put your energy somewhere, how are you going to make those decisions about what you do to make sure it's got the biggest impact on your emotional well-being? So one way of doing that is linking to the approach we talked before. So you might think about activities that switch on your soothing system or your drive system. So that can have an impact on that kind of level of kind of threat and feeling anxious. But another way of doing it is thinking about your values. So what we mean when we talk about values is talking to people about what matters most to them. So what lights them up, what they want to stand for, what they believe in. So things that really deeply feel right to people, because if you've not got a lot of energy to be trying to move towards the things that light you up and that are important, is much easier than trying to get you to do the things that feel like they're hard work. We're asking people to try and identify their values. It's for 2 reasons, really. One is that they're making sure that they're putting their energy into the things that matter to them most. But also it can be like a compass that when you're facing some kind of difficulties as you're going through your cancer journey, you're trying to manage your fatigue, I think having a sense of, well, what are my values, and really having pinned those down helps you in those moments where you could go in 2 particular directions. With a compass, then it helps us to kind of stay on track and keep moving in the direction that we want to, even through difficult times. And one of the things that we often talk to patients about is the concept of a choice point. So a choice point is a time when, and we might have hundreds of these in a day, where there's a fork in the road. We could go one way or we could go the other. And what we're trying to help people to do is, because they've noticed and named their values, that they're making towards moves. But what often happens is, at a choice point, difficult thoughts and feelings show up, which end up, if you get hooked into those, pulling you away and you make an away move. So an example of this might be somebody who is struggling with fatigue, and they're a parent, and normally they would, when their daughter's school play comes up, they would be really in amongst it. They might be making costumes, they might be helping with teas and coffees in the interval. So this event's coming up, and we might think about, how can I make a towards move in relation to this? So in that choice point, the things that might show up, difficult thoughts like, well, I can't manage all afternoon, I can't help with the teas and coffees the way I usually do, I couldn't be on my feet. Some of the emotions that might go with that might be worry, might be guilt. There might be thoughts around, I'm not the parent I want to be, what will the other parents think? So again, difficult feelings around worry and shame. So if somebody got hooked into all of those thoughts, they could well end up getting pulled away, making an away move, maybe avoiding going to that event, and having a really big impact in terms of their quality of life. So if we're applying some of the techniques that we've talked about, the first thing we might be thinking about is acceptance. Things are as they are. I can't change the fact that my body won't do what I want it to do. Making space for some sadness around that and some frustration, not trying to talk yourself into kind of putting on a brave face, just, might be before you make any decisions, you just allow some space for that. Noticing the thoughts that go with it, but not getting hooked into them. And then maybe starting to think flexibly about, well, maybe I couldn't do what I used to do, but is there something that's in line with my values as a supportive parent, if that's the value that I'm wanting to hook into? What could I do that doesn't look exactly like it used to, but might still be a way of being a supportive parent? So that might be, maybe I rest for the morning if I'm doing that in the afternoon, using that spoons idea. Maybe I'm not doing costumes, I'm not doing teas and coffees, but I'm absolutely in the front row, cheering, smiling, clapping. My daughter can be there, she can see I'm supporting her. I'm not doing some of the other things I would normally do, but absolutely I am being a supportive parent in that moment. Using those unhooking techniques, those kind of name it to tame it techniques about any of those thoughts that might show up about what will other people think, and noticing and naming those rather than getting hooked into them. And that way of reminding yourself that even if it's exhausting, even if it's tiring, this is in service of something that matters to me. It's where I want to put my energy. It's where I want to spend my spoons. And I think what I've seen with people is if they keep making those towards moves, even if life's not exactly as it used to be, it does mean that there are these moments where it feels like life's worth living. And I think in terms of managing your mood when you're fatigued, those moments are really golden and really important. One of the things that we see with people with fatigue is that sometimes one of the values they need to hook into a bit more is around looking after themselves. And a number of people I've worked with where maybe the values that they prioritised in the past were taking care of other people and being the main caretaker in a family. It can be really difficult when you've got cancer and when you're feeling fatigued, because all of a sudden you can't do those things, and for your well-being you need to prioritise yourself. So I think some of the struggle for people is about, when I've got two values that matter to me, it matters to me to look after other people, that's who I've been and who I've always been, but actually right now I really need to look after myself as well. And that's often where some of the self-critical thoughts could kick in, where people feel like I'm being selfish if I say no to things or if I need to rest. So I think all of these techniques are really important at those times where there's sometimes a bit of a conflict in people's values, that two things matter to them. How can they flexibly respond to their lives and the world in a way that means that they are maybe doing things differently, maybe putting themselves first when they haven't done that before. I think that can often be a challenge. I think it's just really important to remember that fatigue is something that affects you emotionally as well as physically, and it might be that at a time like this you need some extra help and advice to get you through. So yeah, if people would like some extra support, you can always speak to your medical team and they can refer you to a psychology service like ours or to a local mental wellbeing service.